Hello and welcome to another episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Gibson, and I'm coming to you live on a Saturday, which I don't normally record on, but sometimes when you get guests who you think are going to come through with an all-star show, you kind of make accommodation. And I know the guy on the other end, Kyle Travis, a very, very busy man. And I'm sure we'll cover some of what consumes that time. But Kyle, before we jump into things, maybe you can just give us an update on how you're doing. It's Halloween's tomorrow. That's going to kind of time stamp the show for everyone listening to it. So how are things going with you?
Yeah, I'm doing really well, man. Thanks for having me on. So just finished graduating, finally moved from Tennessee, moved down to Florida. Doing a postdoc over at the University of Florida now. So I've always wanted to be a Florida Gator, and now I actually have a reason to be one and claim that. So that's been a lot of fun. As you alluded to, it's taking up all of my time, days and nights, and unfortunately weekends. But yeah, hopefully I'll be able to start breathing here in the next few weeks.
Yeah, and I remember on your Instagram, and I could be wrong, your one of your original handles or your original handle, I don't know when you created the account, was the Strength Nerd.
Yep,
Is that right?
correct. Yep,
Yeah,
that's correct.
and before we get into the science side of things, I know people always get a little up in arms about getting researchers on here because they don't understand practice or they don't have any skin in the game. You're really strong. So maybe you could just kind of take us through your, you know, time lifting weights, what you've done, anything notable, and what that'll bridge us into what actually got you interested in studying this stuff in the first place.
Yeah. So let's see. My strength career, I guess we could say, quotes. Um, I started off in bodybuilding. Moved to Hattiesburg, Mississippi, at the University of excuse me, almost said the University of Ole Miss, University of Southern Mississippi, and there was a powerlifting, strongman, Highland game, like bodybuilding gym there, and so I met a lot of really cool people, and ultimately they got me into powerlifting first. So I started powerlifting, and then I got introduced into strongman, and then Highland games, and so I was doing all of that during undergrad, plus like working 40 hours a week, doing just crazy time stuff as far as training, going to school, and working goes. Um, I don't know if I would say that I'm super strong. For a researcher, I think I have some pretty good. I've moved some pretty significant weight as far as that goes, as far as like being a quote unquote scientist goes. So, um, squatted close to 600 pounds, benched 440, pulled over around 660, so they have 300 kilos. I for strongman, I usually would get my ass kicked just because I would go up against some really big, fast, strong dudes. But I had a lot of fun doing that. Highland Games, I got to do one of the really big games over in North Carolina, so that was a lot of fun. Was considered like a North American championship. Once again, I didn't come in last. I came in top 10 out of 14. So that was cool, and we got to play with like a bunch of pros and stuff like that. And then I've done some strength lifting. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's
Yeah.
back squat, press, and then conventional deadlift only. So I've done some of that as well. Everything but weightlifting. So yeah, so the whole idea behind Strength Nerd was like, hey, I'm a strength sport enthusiast, and then I really started to get involved with the research and like the literature and what was going on, and so yeah, so that's how all that kind of came about.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect, where the more you know, seemingly the less you feel like you know, and at the front end of that, you know the least, and you feel like you know the most. You're the most confident in what you claim to know. That's kind of the same thing with strength. I feel like the stronger you get, the weaker you feel like you really are. When you compare it to the best of the best, or the people who've been around, it starts to make you think about what strength is a little differently. So when you say you've benched 200 kilos, I think pretty much everyone on this podcast listening, no one's done that. So I think it's pretty impressive. Uh, you mentioned starting that interest or developing that interest kind of in your undergrad. What was the career path you were taking kind of during your undergrad, and then as you started working up the graduate school ladder, so to speak, how did that change?
So I think, like most folks doing the exercise science route, I was only doing it for PT, of course, physical therapy. And while I was there, I was also working at a sports medicine clinic. And between the boss at the sports medicine clinic and then a guy by the name of Dr. Mike Webster, who was at Southern Miss at the time, um, both of those like kind of simultaneously started to get me interested in research because the questions that I would ask was not typical of someone who is interested in just PT, right? PT, if you are a physical therapist out there, this is no offense, anything like that, but a lot of folks that I know that are in a DPT program or they are now a DPT, a lot of their practices are not like evidence based, so to speak. And so on my end, the questions I would ask were ultimately ending with no answers. Like, I
Mm.
don't really know. We just kind of use these protocols because this other clinic, they use it and it just works. So that led me into, starting to find out what PubMed was and like Google Scholar and things like this. And so ultimately, Dr. Mike Webster is the one that like pulled me in his office and he's like, look, I really think that you should begin to move forward with a more of a research driven career idea rather than this PT stuff because you're going to be super limited as a physical therapist. At the time at Southern Miss, there was this guy now, Dr. Sean Quesenberry. He gave me the Bompa periodization book.
Mm.
And so I read this and I was like, holy hell, what is this magic? So found out about Dr. Mike Stone over at ETSU, looked into a few other programs, but my primary interest at the time was with Dr. Stone just because with his track record, it was all based around strength and power athletes and periodization, and then all the high level individuals that they had worked with over their career. That's ultimately what I was wanting to go do because I wasn't interested in really working with the lower tier, like regional folks or local folks. Not that there's anything wrong with that, because that's who I was at the time as well. I was interested in elite performance, like those at the highest level. And then, went from Southern Miss, went straight to ETSU, got accepted, did my master's there, and then my PhD. Um, but now we're going into biomedical sciences. So slightly different, but just because I am much more interested in the molecular side of things and the wet lab side of things. So I can still answer a lot of questions in sports science now, just I have a different perspective on things. And maybe on down the road, I could take some of these new techniques that I'm learning in biomedical sciences and come back to sports science and just blow the field wide open. So
Mm.
maybe. But
And we'll obviously get into what you studied during your master's and your PhD, but with the change in interest, at least the kind of the change in career trajectory, are you still into like lifting and coaching and being involved with strength sports? Are you kind of changing your interest almost wholesale as you kind of change your career?
so as far as coaching goes, I have fired all of my clients just because from a time perspective, I don't
Right.
have the time to sit down and program. Um, Also, I don't want to have clients that I can't give 100% of my attention to and actually sit down and dedicate, provide like the appropriate time to give them the needed program that they need. So I just had to fire all of them, unfortunately. So if you are one of my, I guess now ex clients, I am so sorry. But maybe in the future we could do something. I'm still training. I'm not really competing, or I have no intentions of competing. Um, Still doing some like powerlifting, still doing like I guess some bodybuilding stuff. I also walk like 18,000 steps a day just because the UF campus is so big. And so we have to like walk across campus, walk from parking garages all over the place. Um, I am kind of interested in this thing called tactical games. So if anybody
Yeah.
knows about the tactical games, like I'm kind of interested in that. Not very keen on the running side of all of that. Because I do weigh like 105 to 110 kilos, give or take sometimes. So yeah, I don't know how that would actually work out, but I am interested in doing something like that. So,
Yeah, that's awesome. I actually have someone I coach in weightlifting, but he kind of competes or dabbles in the tactical game stuff. He's a big. I don't know if it's appropriate to say this, but like big gun guy. You know, he loves
yeah,
like playing with guns and buying guns and checking them out and all that stuff. Kind of out of my
yeah,
wheelhouse, but I think it's kind of like equipped CrossFit almost, if we could call it that.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, it's really cool, really interesting thinking about the domains of that sport. So when we if we transition back to your master's, when you were in school at ETSU, how did that start to shift your focus, and what did you start looking into specifically with the research that you were beginning to conduct?
So I'll slightly back up a little bit to my training and what got me interested in doing that specific topic for
Hmm.
tapering and peaking for my master's. So as a strength athlete, there was a lot of high level folks that I was working with and training with and competing with, but none of them really had any sort of specific protocol that they would use leading into a competition. And so I was told one of two things: just take 7 days off and you'll be fine, or uh, pretty much reduce all your training by half and then take a few days off and do that for like 2 weeks and then you'll be good to go. So
Hmm.
me seeing these guys that are like way better, way stronger than I am, I'm like, okay, got it, noted. Take 7 days off, don't do anything. On the other end, like whatever training I'm doing, do it by half for 2 weeks, and then I'm gonna go compete. So because of that, looking back at my numbers then, like pre-science days, uh, probably not the best competition outcomes, just because at one point in time, I literally did 3 powerlifting meets in 3 months. So each
Wow.
one was like 30 days apart. In my mind, I'm like, oh, well, I'm just going to literally get better and just keep progressing, progressing, progressing. I had this really overzealous idea that I'm going to do 12 meets in a year. Needless to say, once I got to that third one, I was like, there will not be a fourth one for a long time. So, and again, this was just because this is what the lifters were telling me to do, and I had no idea what was going on. I get to ETSU, so fast forward to ETSU now. I meet Dr. Caleb Baszler. He's a
Mm.
student at the time, and so he was actually finishing his dissertation. So he and I would be in the training hall, and then we would kind of talk about, preparing for competitions and things like that. And so lo and behold, wow, for strength and power athletes, we don't really know what to do relative to what the literature says.
Mhm.
And so because of that, it's like, oh, well, there's all these questions that we need to try to answer. And so during that time, I believe that he did some of the stuff with weightlifters and throwers, and was playing with team sport athletes as well, as far as trying to figure out, an optimal means of tapering and peaking. Um, and so then that kind of got me involved with the weightlifting, tapering and peaking case study series that I did. Ultimately, we collected data over a whole entire year with three of the best weightlifters that have ever come through that program. That program being ETSU.
Mhm.
Um, and so because of that, that's what got us on that route. And we found some really interesting stuff. All of which is not published, unfortunately. But yeah, like that kind of turned things on its head for us to shift into what we ended up getting to do for the PhD.
Yeah, and I don't know how much you've thought through, what you knew about lifting, kind of pre science days, pre ETSU days, what you learned while you were at ETSU, kind of the ideas you were developing, kind of the framework you developed for training strength power athletes, and then the ideas and thoughts that kind of came out on the back end of that. So before we get to that kind of more broad strokes question of, what do you think the body of literature has to say about how we should powerlift, weightlift, etc. um, let's talk specifically about what you did study. So, whatever was kind of looked at and researched for the masters. I mean, as you said, the case studies aren't available. But then with your dissertation and your PhD, how was that informed by what you did in the master's program? And then what research did you eventually end up doing that has started to kind of come out of the pipeline? I know one paper was recently published, and I started reading through it, but maybe we can get into that stuff.
Yeah, so the whole thing during the master, actually, so there is a case study series that is published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, or JSCR. Um, but I only have two of those athletes published and not the third one yet.
Right.
So, um, the whole thing with that is that that tapering regimen was just based off of quote unquote what the literature says to do. According to what the literature was telling us, use a overreach on like week 4, and then you do a 3-week exponential taper after that, and then you should be good to go. That's ultimately what it said. So for my PhD, what I wanted to do, so I actually published a paper in Sports for tapering and peaking for powerlifting performance. That was a systematic review. And so I really did a deep dive on what the literature actually says for squat, bench, and deadlift with strength and power athletes relative to peaking. And so ultimately, we found a little bit of different information. And so I know that you've had Dr. Hayden Pritchard on. So Pritchard and I are good friends. We've done some collaborations together. But he published his review back in 2015, I believe.
Right.
And so mine came out in 2020, so 5 years later. Ultimately, his said that you should, taper between 1 to 4 weeks. I'm not saying that's wrong, but based off of what we saw, the literature kind of suggests 1 to 2 weeks may be a more optimal means. And so when we're peaking, we're trying to get optimal performance. Sure, you could still be above baseline at week 3, week 4 of a taper, but what is going to get the best, the highest performance output? And so that was kind of interesting, kind of, I guess, novel to a stance, just because if you look at most of the literature on tapering from like Dr. Mojica, it's always 1 to 4 weeks, but that is relative to endurance sports, or primarily geared toward endurance sports. And then on the strength and power side, what do? We just take that model and then try to implement it with what we do. And so again, that was just something that's like, I don't know if this is right. Like, I really don't know if that's optimal. And so the literature said 1 to 2 weeks. And then as far as taper mode goes, we saw step tapers being used and exponential tapers being used the most. And I actually think it was like 7 and 7, if I'm not wrong. And then one used linear taper. Yeah, I believe so. Yes, linear taper. So overarching in the literature was step taper or exponential taper. Well, which one's best? We don't know. So we had to try to figure that stuff out. And so that's what led us into our study designs for the experimental study that we just got published, which was ultimately comparing the step taper versus an exponential taper. And with a step taper, we did that 1 week taper, which was kind of also similar to what the athletes did based off another study that we just recently got accepted. And then we did what the literature suggested for the 3 week, your typical training regimen. And the other thing too with these tapers that we designed for this specific study, you have to remember that this was not a study that was just, we randomly recruited powerlifters, just brought them in for 6 weeks, and then this was it. Most of these folks, actually, I believe all for this, because I did two. This one, I believe everybody was already part of my powerlifting team that I created at ETSU. So they had already, they were training. Despite the pandemic, they were still training. So this is just a snapshot, a 6 week snapshot of what they did specifically for this study. So I just want to preface that, because most people will see this, oh, well, major limitation, it's 6 weeks long. Sure, yes, it's 6 weeks, but we're just capturing 6 weeks. Like, no, they didn't take any time off way before this, right? Like it's not, again, just random people like from the rec center. Hey, man, can you power lift? Cool. Come on. In 2 weeks, we're going to start a study. So I just think that's really important to preface that, again, because most people will see this as a major limitation of just 6 weeks. So.
Yeah, and the paper we're referring to and going to start digging into, it's called Skeletal Muscle Adaptations and Performance Outcomes Following a Step and Exponential Taper in Strength Athletes. Again, Kyle Travis is the lead author. So before we get into this, the paper itself, we can, well, I guess this is part of the paper. It's almost like an introduction, but we can talk about the theoretical basis for tapering, but like how that would be organized within a peak, kind of the one and the same, right? You're trying to peak performance. So how does workload change over time to allow that to happen? So maybe you can talk about the theoretical basis for a taper and what you're hoping to make happen, or what we kind of theorize should be happening as you taper to have your best performance on competition day in a powerlifting meet.
Yeah. So I think it's important to lay out the definition of what a taper is, because a lot of people like to clump together the terms taper and deload, and that drives me nuts, because a deloading and a taper is not the same thing. So if you're out there and you talk about tapering, but you're actually using the word deload, stop it. It's not the same thing. So in my opinion, deload is more of a sporadic type of training, a down training period. Like you may or may not need it. Whereas a taper is a specifically constructed point in time. So like if you are, 4 months out from a competition. Your taper is already planned, or your period's already planned for when you're going to quote unquote taper. The purpose behind the taper is to reduce enough of the training so that you can physiologically and psychologically recover in order to actually express your performance. So again, it's a planned period, not a sporadic period or just a random point in time where, oh, I think I'll take off now because I'm feeling pretty beat up. So, and again, that duration can last between 1 week all the way up to 4 weeks. So, uh, what was your other question?
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, it's just kind of discussing the theoretical basis for tapering, and again, some things I've heard that are brought up when you kind of talk about changing the training load or reducing training load would be shifting a fiber type, muscle fiber types. You're obviously reducing fatigue so you can display performance. Um, all of these things that kind of come together or consolidate to form peak
Yeah.
performance, right? And that's kind of the also part of the theoretical basis of an overreach is you're creating so much fatigue, and you're trying to suppress performance to a point that when you unload the volume, unload the training, you get the spike up or the super compensation up. Maybe you can look at it from one like a kind of muscle physiology perspective, and then I think we could brush on the psychological perspective as well.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think of the best way to explain this because there could be a lot to unpack here.
Sure.
So if you go from normal training and then you go into your overreach prior to the taper, ultimately, so like a very typical ETSU method of doing this would be going from 3x5s, which is essentially nothing, up to 5x5, which isn't a whole lot more, and then you're going to go into like 3x3s. So the premise behind that would be that you go from normal training up to 5x5 for your quote unquote functional, or it's really a planned overreach, but they would consider it a functional overreach. I don't think that that's going to be enough volume to elicit any sort of, say, like muscle cellular like swelling or hypertrophy or anything like that. I think that their premise behind that is that you may get a small adaptation, albeit in 1 week. I doubt it. But you may get some slight adaptation over that week so that during your long drug out tapering slash detraining period, you're not going to lose any muscle mass. But from all of the stuff that we saw, particularly like with the weightlifters, they always lose their muscle mass during these 3 week long tapers. So an optimal taper you should be able to maintain that muscle mass during that quote unquote reduced training period rather than losing muscle. And so, with that, like another big ETSU thing, right, is the whole hypertrophy and drive strength thing. So, if you can maintain that muscle size, then your performance should be at least the same, potentially better if fatigue has dissipated appropriately. And so, I think that ideally, what you should do is you go from normal training to a ton of training for that overreach, and then you just come
Mm.
back to normal training rather than for the taper, you would come back to normal training levels rather than reduce below your normal training levels, particularly if you're doing like a 3x5 as your normal training regimen. Just because, again, that's not a whole lot of volume, right? And then as far as like intensity and things like that go, typically, it is suggested to increase intensity. And again, this goes back to the Pritchard review. They suggest to maintain, typically maintaining intensity would mean, I believe, 85% 1RMs, but maintain or increase intensity. Well, in powerlifting, you can't increase intensity a whole lot more, right? Like you're knocking on the door of maxing out. And so one thing that was never noted until our review in 2020, you could probably more than likely reduce intensity by a
Mm.
lot to make sure that you recover and still get appropriate adaptations at the competition or the testing day or whatever it may be. So, as far as intensity goes, I think for strength and power, you can do anything you want with it. Just don't do anything silly like try to do 110% squat with people standing around doing AEL type stuff. Like maybe, but you should probably be cautious of something like that. And then you also have like training frequency, training durations. As far as what the literature shows, that doesn't really seem to play a big role for the strength and power side of things. So ultimately, just maintain what you would normally be doing again. So that way, physiologically, I think that's good for us meaning strength and power folks. So that way, you're not manipulating every single variable of your training. So then that way, your body can keep doing what it's been doing, and you're not gonna like give it a shock like, oh my god, I got 2 extra days off. I'm only training 4 days a week. What am I gonna do now? So, because believe it or not, going back to me taking 7 days off, what I know now, hey, that's probably not a good idea.
Mhm.
So, yeah,
And I guess that kind of brings up the validity or the actual utility, or I guess the ability of an overreach to create a meaningful effect for someone's training. So you talked about it like in this acute context, there might be a small change or a small bump up. Um, does that actually create any meaningful adaptation? Well, it's kind of hard to say, but it's unlikely. So do you think with a significant amount or a significant enough amount of volume added on top of like what would be like a kind of like a chronic training load over time, like a chronic kind of like rolling training load over time. Do you think an overreach could be beneficial in terms of creating like a more drastic kind of like adaptation on the tail end of a training program or training plan before a meet? Because again, yeah, thinking about it, this like one-off instance of an overreach within a 12-week, 16-week training program, depending on the frequency of it, it does seem kind of like a drop in the bucket. So maybe you can kind of talk about your thoughts on actually using overreaching weeks to create like a meaningful adaptation, considering that training doesn't occur in this like vacuum of 6 weeks.
yep. So again, going back to our definitions, let's lay this out real quick. So typically, when you have an overreach, it should be coined a planned overreach,
Mhm.
right? So you're planning to do an overreach. You can only determine if it was functional or non-functional after the
Gotcha.
fact. So you can't like again, say we're 4 months out and we have an overreach plan. We can't say this is going to be a functional overreach unless you do something like I'm only doing 3x5s and I'm going to do a 5x5. Yeah, I would bet that's just going to be functional. You're probably not going to be driven to the ground from just increasing by 2 sets. I doubt it. So, um, what you need to do, in my opinion, for a really good overreach to actually work, and we saw this with some of the weightlifting stuff that I've done, you need to drive their ass in the ground in order for it to be effective. And so you should do a 150 to a 200% increase in volume
Wow.
for 1 week, maybe even 2 weeks. So side note, during my master's, with the peaking and tapering stuff that we did, excuse me, tapering and peaking, your title has it backwards, so it's throwing me off. Dr. Mojica, if you ever hear this, I'm sorry. It's tapering and peaking, so he's gonna kill me. So during my master's, they would typically do like 2 weeks of 5x5s, and oh my god, at the end of that second week, their like jumping performance, all their laboratory measures would go through the roof.
Mm,
They weren't dying. They were actually it was as if they received an appropriate dose of training to actually express their fitness characteristics, and then they would taper right for 2 weeks or three or typically 3 weeks, and then all those performance adaptations would fall off.
mm,
Sure, they would be above their normal training measurements, but relative to that overreach week or their second overreach week, it was never that high again. So during the dissertation with the overreaches that we use, we actually used 150% overreach to make sure that everybody was dying. And I believe that it actually equated to 7x5s on everything. And when I say
ooh,
everything, 7x5s and 7x3s. So when I say everything, I mean everything. So in a given session, we were squatting, benching, deadlifting 7x3s at like 90%, 95%. So those sessions took a long time. But at the end of all of that, everybody was like, oh my God, I need some rest now. And at which point, yeah, you probably need the taper in order to actually recover. And as you alluded to, the supercompensation effect, that's ultimately what you're trying to get out of that. Whereas if you just prescribe like the typical 3x5 to a 5x5, I believe the increase for that overreach was like maybe 30% in volume. Like that's nothing. That's literally nothing. So in order for an overreach to truly be effective, I think 150 to 200% is a really good idea. There's a lot of work from Dr. Keijo Häkkinen from over in Finland from back in the 80s and the 90s, as well as Dr. Andy Fry and Dr. Stone, where they did a lot of overreaching stuff with like junior national weightlifters. All of them, every single time, they would just do overreaches with the weightlifters of 200 to 300% increases in volume. They would see insane performance outputs, which begs the question, well, is a taper even effective then? Could we just overreach our way into a meet? I think maybe, but yeah, I digress.
Well, that would for me that would beg the question of the frequency of these kind of planned overreaching periods, because again, it's kind of coming back to the idea that it would occur a certain distance out from a meet. You're able to taper and let off some of the fatigue and then express performance. But if you're getting these huge spikes in performance, it's kind of like, well, if you can go to the well once and you have 16 weeks of training, should you go to the well more often and just maybe um, undulate training volumes a little bit more throughout the training program? Like, what are your thoughts on utilizing this strategy more frequently within, say a macro cycle for a power lifter?
Yeah, so I've actually played with some of this before. I know if anyone from ETSU hears me say this, they're probably going to just die right there. But like, sure, block periodization is great. However, I've also used DUP at some points in time, and so similar to like kind of what we're discussing with like a higher volume week, lower volume week, higher week volume week, lower volume week, that has actually been very effective for a lot of folks, um, particularly for power lifters. And I think that it's probably just because that higher volume week, they may not be dying at the end of that first one that we give them, but they're accruing X amount of hypertrophic adaptation, or at least starting that process in order to maybe carry on some more of that in the second time that we implement that at week 3. Give them that one down week so they can kind of recover and then hit them again, but hit them a little bit harder. And so, yeah, I think stuff like that is perfectly fine and very effective. Again, it depends on who you talk to. They'll tell you no, that goes against what the literature says, but I call BS on that because there's a lot of folks, even outside of the said science world, that use stuff like that, and they compete at a super high level. They're stupid jacked, and you cannot convince me otherwise. So
Yeah, I actually remember I took a course with Spencer Arnold, who coaches at Power and Grace Performance. He's coached 3 Olympians at this point, and he has an advanced weightlifter program where he kind of takes you through developing like a 12-week program. And he uses some sort of like undulating strategy where he will fluctuate volume from week to week to week, where you'll have a moderate volume week, a high volume week, a lower volume week, and then a moderate volume week. And again, he coaches 3 Olympians, so I
yeah,
tend to listen to people like that. As far as the timeline of something like this, so you mentioned having like this big spike or this big stimulus, this big driver of adaptation, and with something like muscle size, it's like a relatively slow growing process. You're not accreting grams and grams and grams of muscle tissue daily, right? It's very small
correct.
amounts. So how does that kind of the physiological timeline of developing something like muscle or developing like these neurological adaptations for maximal strength, how does that change with these fluctuations in volume? Because it wouldn't make sense necessarily if you're wanting to keep the machinery intact to drastically drop off volume leading into a meet. So taking 3 weeks and chopping down volume, chopping down volume. Maybe you can talk about the timeline of detraining some of these qualities and how that plays into tapering strategies that you looked at in this paper.
Yeah. So as far as I guess actually observing hypertrophic adaptations. Now we could do that on like an ultrasound device, albeit that has major limitations to the person that's actually collecting the data, how you analyze that data, things like that. So anytime you read any of those papers that just use ultrasound, you should take a lot of caution on that, especially if they're saying, "Oh, all this hypertrophy occurred." Um, Usually, I would say, to my understanding, like it would be around like you say that you provide a given hypertrophic stimulus. Around 4 weeks is whenever everything kind of turns on.
Mm.
To my understanding, and then you should probably continue that for like say up to 12 or 13 weeks after the fact. So that way you are truly focusing on hypertrophic adaptations. You can actually get a significant outcome from that, assuming that all the training is appropriate, your nutrition is appropriate, things like that. Think of it as like a specific or excuse me, damn it, a specific training phase leading up to the competition training phase, right? If you look at the whole macro cycle, um, a lot of the folks that I've actually worked with, I typically would do like hypertrophic season, so to speak, for like 4 to 6 months, and
Oh
then we
wow.
would shift that to our competition period for like 5 or 6 months. So then that way, that whole first part of the year or their season, although we don't really have seasons for competing like off season, on season. But we can really focus on their size, like really get their body comp where we need it to be. So that way, when we do the lower volumes, we're not sacrificing any of that tissue loss or anything like that. And then that way, whenever you do implement, say, a 2 week overreach, and then you come back down to normal training, as long as you're coming back to normal training, you should be okay. And then if that overreach volume is high enough, perhaps that is enough stimulus to actually allow the physiological adaptation to be maintained. So then that way nothing is lost. Whereas if you go back to what I was talking about with the typical like ETSU overreach method of like the very, very small overreach of like maybe 30%, I don't think that's enough volume increase in order to allow the muscle tissue to kind of hold on, right? Just because it's already so low. Um, so that would also go into like the individuality of athletes. Like I've had some people where I've like played with overreaches, like literally 10 by fives, 10 sets of five. um, and they were fine, right? Like they looked great. They were fine. They're like, oh, can we do it again next week? Like absolutely not, because in 2 days you're going to be dying. Whereas others, like maybe a 6 by 5 or something like that, is like their wall. And this could go into the whole MEV MRV type of argument as well. But trying to figure out the perfect amount of volume or overall volume for each individual athlete that would allow them to maintain all of that's going to eventually play into how you're going to manipulate those overreach periods after that normal training period, and then also their tapers and things like that.
Yeah, I was thinking about like Mike Israel's kind of concepts of MEV, MRV, and I was curious to get your thoughts, but I guess is like broad brushstrokes. You have a certain amount of volume that is effective to keep the adaptations, a certain amount that's effective to drive creating more adaptations. So I don't know if you have any thoughts beyond that of them kind of being like general concepts. Have you given those terms much thought?
I mean, yeah, I feel like they're pretty straightforward. They're pretty basic for the most part. One thing that I have noticed is that females tend to be able to complete more volume for a longer period of time compared to a lot of the male athletes. So for whatever reason, their MRV is a lot at a much different level than a lot of the males, and so they can just complete a ton of work. Sure, it may be due to the absolute loads being used and things like that, but relatively speaking, if you look at it on relative terms, they're typically doing the same, if not more, than the guys. So I've always found that quite interesting, and that was, I mean, even similar in my dissertation. Like the females were like crushing the guys on the overreach weeks. So I was like, wow, y'all are pretty badass.
Well, I think to my lifters' chagrin, they might be seeing a little bit more volume in the higher volume weeks because of this podcast. So we'll have to play around with bigger spikes and then see how that kind of manages when things level out. So I appreciate that. Now, as far
Yeah.
as the actual study goes, the one that was just published or just open for access or made available for access. Let's talk about, and I think there's a lot wrapped in there. You talked about using ultrasound to measure, muscle size. You talked about, how that can be a little shoddy. Um, also talked about a lot of the other concepts within the podcast itself, leading up until this point. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of the paper. Maybe you can talk about the design, the setup, and then we can kind of go on about the findings, and then anything that, special considerations, I guess, or what should be taken with a grain of salt when someone reads this and say, hey, this should be able to help inform practice.
Yeah. So if we looked at my overall dissertation layout, so that way I can kind of preface how the
Yeah.
study was designed. Um, Again, the first study that we did was a systematic review to see, what the literature says. It said step taper, exponential taper. Well, we already know that exponential tapers are primarily used, and we kind of already know the outcomes of that, which typically lead to muscle loss, despite peaking or not. So we have that, and then we did a tapering survey. So shout out to everybody, all like 700 and something folks who did that for me, from the USAPL and CPU, so the Canadian, almost said Canadian, Canadian. Oh my God, I can't talk. Canadian. So thanks to all those guys that helped out with that as well. But ultimately, we want to see what lifters were doing, and the lifters tended to do a lot shorter taper, and they tend to use the step taper method, and that just got published as well. And so, I mean, we could talk about that after the fact. But with that, it was okay. So this is what the literature says. This is what lifters are doing. Well, which is most effective? We don't know. And so with this study, it was comparing the 1 week step taper versus the 3 week exponential taper. So another way to look at this is, what are the bros doing versus the scientists doing? And let's see which is most effective. So for the training program, I'm trying to think of how to go through this. This was kind of like a typical training regimen that you would see for a powerlifter. So we were training 3 days a week. There was a lot of like Shako-esque added into this. So if you know anything about like the Boris Shako Russian coach programming, we kind of used a lot of those methodologies and principles, just because that's how I would typically program for my folks as well, which is primarily a pretty good bit of volume most of the time. And the other thing behind that was to make sure that muscle mass was going to be increased, or at the very least not lost. I did not want to see anyone reducing their muscle size at any level, just because I had a feeling like, hey, it is possible to not lose muscle mass. And we keep seeing that over and over and over. So instead of the typical 3x5, we did the 4x5s. And so 4x5s at constant loads. So there was no down sets or anything like that. I keep alluding back to the ETSU methods, but that's just because that's where I was. And so we had to play by those rules. The typical down set option at ETSU is like you would do 50% of the previous bar load that you had. And so 1 set of 5 of a down set. Guess what? I don't think that that's doing a whole lot of anything. So instead, we're just going to keep the bar load the same and do 4x5. And I would also like to say that I piloted this training regimen for 1 year before we actually implemented it. And let me tell you, doing 4x5s or 7x5s or 8x5s, whatever it may be, you can gain a ton of muscle mass, like quantified skeletal muscle mass, from just doing 4x5s. So it's kind of like, okay, well, this is working for me, and I had piloted it with some of the other lifters as well. And so we were seeing all of these muscle increases with just normal training. So it's like, okay, so we can make sure that they increase their muscle mass, give them an overreach that's going to drive them into the ground. So that's where we did the 150% increase. And then we did a 50% reduction relative to the overreach. So that brought us back down to relatively the normal training values again, like we had talked about earlier, just because I wanted to try to not reduce it too much below that. And then we also decreased the training intensity during this training program. So I believe that we decreased it between 20 to 25% during the tapers, which is like a significant amount compared to everything else, because all the other literature has maintained training intensity between 80 to 85% or increased it by 5 to 10%. So this was also the first tapering study with strength athletes to reduce intensity, and we got, the outcomes that we were looking for. Because an interesting thing, at least for all of my cohort, a lot of the folks really struggled with training with super high intensities for a prolonged period of time. And so for whatever reason, like even psychologically, they were just like, I guess, dead in a sense of like, hey, we're always training between 85 to like 97.5%. I need a break. And so it's almost as if that intensity reduction helped on the mental side as well as the physiological side. So then that way, when we did our mock meets, they were able to, oh, I got a little break, I got a little recovery. So now we can crush everything. So um, that was a training program. Do you want me to go into what testing procedures that we were
Yeah,
able to do?
yeah, I think so. I think that would be useful.
Okay. So we typically always do ultrasound at the ETSU lab. A lot of other studies as well always use ultrasound to kind of quantify muscle size changes. This is usually done in the vastus lateralis of your quad, which is kind of like the sides, the actual side of your quad. And so we coupled this with muscle biopsies. And so, where we actually did the muscle measurements at 50% length of the quadricep is where we also took the biopsy. So then that way, and this was kind of done, I wouldn't say it was I wanted to tattoo the athletes, but I would just take a permanent marker and like keep like from week to week to week, I kept marking it so that way we wouldn't lose the spot. Um, so yeah, I believe like Dr. Hakkinen back in the day over in Finland, they were able to like tattoo markers like that on their athletes, but I don't think the IRBs here will allow stuff like that anymore. So we were able to do the whole muscle measurements and then look at all of the muscle fibers, and then we even went down to the single fiber typing, which is a pretty novel new thing in sports science for the most part, and the method that we used, no one has ever done before. And then we also looked at the genes and the microRNAs. So then that way we could literally determine, hey, are we actually seeing true muscle size changes, or is this just an over speculation? Like, do we just think that this is what we see? So then that way we can literally cover our basis at every single possible level to determine, hey, we see muscle loss, muscle maintenance, or muscle increases. And then we also did a bunch of performance measurements as well. I don't know if you want to talk about any of that.
Yeah, I'm not sure how relevant, I guess, do you think the performance measurements are? Because I mean, the isometric squat, I could see that being useful. The squat jump, I don't know how useful you think that would be, or how strongly that would relate with performance. But maybe you could go on about that.
So Ed, we'll do this super brief. Powerlifters don't do any jump testing. You guys can't jump. Some of you might be able to, but it's not very effective. So don't use it. Squat, the ISO squat, it's okay. At the end of the day, do 1RMs. Like that. That is ultimately going to tell you if you're achieving an adaptation or if you're not. All the metrics that you can get from doing the squat jump or counter movement jumps or even the ISO squat, those are all cool. But at the end of the day, if they're not improving their 1RM, nobody cares. I didn't care. I wanted to see their squat go up, their bench go up, and their deadlift go up. I could give a shit less if their RFD changed on ISO squat, right? So I digress. But yeah, do your 1RMs. That's what's most important.
Yeah, I think that resonates with people, especially people who follow Mike Tashir, the guy who pretty much popularized a single at RP8 as a kind of a key performance measurement that you would keep track of over time and see how effective the training is, and that would kind of gauge, where you're going and where you're headed.
Yep.
So I think you laid things out really well, and of course, we're not going to get into all of the nuance and all of the specifics because it's just one, it's over my head, and I think it's just too much for a podcast format. But as far as the implementation of the program, and then all of the assessments or everything you pretty much you did to track the changes, which would take us to the results of the study. Maybe you can kind of lead us into that.
Yeah. So ultimately, the training programs were effective for both groups. And so we did so just a little more detail. So So it was a 6 week peaking regimen. The first 2 weeks were quote unquote normal training, and then they were grouped into the exponential taper group or a step taper group. The step taper group continued normal training for 2 weeks. Then week 5, overreach. Week 6, taper. The exponential taper group on week 3, they did their overreach, followed by their 3 week taper, week 4, 5, 6. And
Mm.
so all these assessments were only done at the beginning and at the end. So, yes, that is a limitation. However, we didn't want any biopsy because we would plan on doing biopsies every week or bi weekly. If any of you guys have ever had a biopsy out there, they suck. Now, we did a microbiopsy rather than the typical Bergstrom biopsy, so it is a little bit more less invasive. So we could have definitely got away with it, but again, per the IRB, like research boards are real sticklers about things like that. And so in their mind, we're like literally removing the whole leg from the athlete if we were to do 6 biopsies. So this is just reflective of the first week of training and then the last week post taper. So um, trying to think of how to explain this. So the program was very, very specific. Again, very similar to what you would see with what powerlifters would typically do. And so it was powerlifting specificity was at an all-time high throughout this. The only accessories that they really had was like pull-ups and dips, and this was to make sure like back musculature was going to continue to increase, tricep musculature was going to increase, and then for whole muscle measurements, we saw an overall like arm girth change. So we used a medical bioelectrical impedance device called Sika, and this has been like validated against MRIs and things like that. So I mean, it has very high validity. The output can be trusted, so to speak. And so overall, arm and leg girth both increased significantly. So did torso, and so I know with weightlifters and powerlifters, a lot of folks tend to, have very thick torsos, particularly powerlifters. And so this just kind of like backs up a lot of that um, anecdotal type of evidence that, these athletes have large midsections. And with that, I mean, that kind of probably contributed to a lot of the performance side of things as well. Because if you have more in the middle, you have, at least you have a sturdier trunk, so to speak. And so that potentially helped with a lot of the outputs that we saw. Um, on the ultrasound, we saw some increases there. So we did the ultrasound at a third of the quadricep length, half, and then 3/4. So then that way we could see, excuse me, 1/3, 1/2, 2/3. So that way we could see the proximal, middle, and the distal, just to see if there were any type of divergent changes across the quad. Um, Overall, there wasn't that much of a difference between all that. It kind of just all grew together, which is what you would want typically. It would be kind of weird if you saw just one part of the quad growing all along. And maybe in bodybuilding circles, you would see something like that, but we didn't see any of that, thankfully. And so that actually kind of reflected what we saw with the muscle fiber increases. And so, same thing, type 1 fibers and type 2A fibers both increased together. And so, kind of interesting. And so, this is just the fiber cross sectional areas. And I believe it's overall, we saw those increases. And so, I know that previously I published a paper about task specific hypertrophy. And
Yep.
so, yes, there's still something there, but at the same time, as a good scientist, I don't know if I'm still putting all my eggs in that basket, just because with this, we saw both fiber types increase despite the training program that was aimed at peaking maximal strength.
Hmm.
So there was also a recent paper published in Nature where they are alluding to this new concept of sarcomere branching. And so despite fiber type changes, potentially there is this like mesh connection system of sarcomeres, again, irregardless of fiber type or motor unit type or anything like that, and everything is contributing to the force output together. So with that, that could potentially explain some of the changes that we saw here with the type 1 fibers and the 2A fibers. On the other side of that, We also provide the athletes with sufficient amounts of volume so that way potentially hypertrophic adaptations could still be observed during their peaking regimen. And because of that volume amount, that could also explain why we see the type 1 and the 2A increase simultaneously. Um, so again, this is just thinking outside the box because typically you wouldn't see this. You would typically see this all going the other way. I know a lot of the previous tapering literature suggests 2x overshoot, like Dr. Stone is a big proponent of the 2x overshoot. Actually, for the fiber type shift, so this is a good segue for fiber type shifting. So we were able to quantify type 1, type 1, 2A hybrids, and then the 2A. As far as the 2X muscle fiber goes, we quantified it. Most folks didn't have a whole lot of 2X fibers because all of these guys were athletes. Some of the super heavyweights, as you would typically see in the literature as well, um, the larger individuals will have more of an abundance of 2x fibers, but that's just attributed to their sedentary lifestyle most of the time. Not saying that all big folks are super sedentary, but at least my super heavy athletes, all they like to do is sit around and eat and come to training, and then that's about it. So that would kind of explain a lot of that. But also on the muscle biochemistry side of things, trying to quantify a 2x fiber, there isn't an antibody that is specific to human 2x. And so whenever you do a lot of these immunohistochemical and like fluorescent imagings, you're just kind of, it's a guessing game. Like you're just kind of looking at this image with this color and assuming that it's a 2x fiber. And so with the single fiber dot blotting method that we did, we were able to remove that subjectivity, and it was either this is what it is or it's not. And so we saw the hybrids actually get everything to move from the type 1 over to the 2A fibers. And again, I think that's just because the amount of volume that we're able to allocate to everyone. There's only been one other tapering study, to my knowledge, by Dr. Kevin Murark from over at University of Kentucky. I think this was back when he was a PhD student with Dr. Trappy. But they did a marathon runner, single fiber taper gene expression study, I believe. And they showed with this marathoner that 2A muscle fiber size actually increased, and so did the fiber count. So we saw the same thing, but that's primarily because we didn't do what you would typically do with the huge volume reduction, because our tapers, again, was only a 50% reduction. And I would also like to note that the reduction of our tapers were controlled. So this wasn't like I guess everyone did 50%. Like, no. It was actually 50%. What we did early on is, so I limited the warm-ups that everyone could do to 4, because that's typically what you could do, right? So like if I want to squat 220 for this session, I could do 70, 120, 170, and then start at 220, and I'm good to go. Sure, that may have some slight variation between people, but for the most part, like that's just throwing reds on, and then you're ready to go. So we were able to take that and build in the algorithm of what their warm-ups were, so that way whenever they tapered, I could use all the warm-up volume and their working volume to make sure that the total work being done was going to be 50%. Because I don't know if you've ever like quantified some of your lifters' warm-ups when they do their own thing, but if you have one person who does 10s and 5s on everything, and another person who just like does the bar for a single and this for a single and that for a single, like, man, you get some crazy differences. So it was important to control all of that. And so because of that, again, I think that kind of contributes to what we saw with all of our single fiber and fiber type transitions. And then at the gene level and the microRNA level, like, yeah, that stuff gets really complicated. But something important to note here, primarily the genes that we looked at some that were associated with hypertrophy and some that were associated with fiber type shifts. With that, and same thing for the microRNAs, all the microRNAs play a role in what the genes were doing at their mRNA level. And so what's important here is that a lot of the molecular things are super, super transient. And so because of that, you have to remember what happened at the second that they did their mock meet. This may not actually be completely reflective or the results that we have for that may not be completely reflective of what was happening on meet day, just because after meet day, like these biopsies were done, like, 4 days later.
Hmm.
So this may be more of, I think, and I actually think that we kind of talked about this, but some of these results at the molecular level may be more indicative of a muscle that has fully recovered after the competition. And again, that's just because it was a couple days after they actually did the 1RMs. So just a limitation. But I mean, the other option that we had was to do a biopsy right before they did 1RMs, and I do not think that that would have went well. So because of that, that's what we got. But yeah,
Okay, and then what were the notable differences between groups? And then you can go into, obviously it's one piece of evidence, right? It's kind of a singular piece of research, but how could people listen to this podcast, read this paper, and then start to develop the thought process of, well, this could inform training in some, you know, useful way, a minor way. Maybe not at all, but it's something that exists and should be considered. So, what were
yep,
the results between groups, and then how does that potentially inform practice?
yep. So if you look at the muscle level, so another thing too is that the work was matched between the two groups. So even though we had one group doing step taper, one group doing exponential taper, they did the total amount of work over the 6 weeks was both the same, right? It was a matter of, think of this paper more of the distribution of work. So when most of the work was completed closer to the competition or in the middle of that 6 week period further away from the competition. So overall, the step taper folks seem to have better outcomes of a quote unquote desired physiological, like muscular environment relative to the competition. And because of that, their squat and their benches came out to be a lot better compared to the exponential taper group. If you look at the exponential taper group, the deadlift and some of their squats were a lot better than the step taper group. So if we think about that from an actual just lifting and coaching perspective,
Mm.
typically squat and bench is trained slightly different than what you would do for deadlift. And you're not, I mean, there's one person, Dr. Caleb Baszler, there's one person that likes to do squat, bench, deadlift all the same, like leading all the way up to the meet. So if you have anybody listening who, squats 500-600 pounds, also deadlifts 500-600 pounds, do you think that's a good idea to do like a 650 pull 2 days before the competition along with a 650 squat? Probably not. Sure, some weaker folks may be able to get away with that, but like that's probably not a good idea. And so, what most folks do, to my understanding, and this also kind of goes into the tapering survey that we did, but the deadlift is done way further out from competition, or at least you could taper it longer compared to the bench and your squatting. And so, it was really cool to see our results really reflect what lifters really do in that aspect. And then also, again, agree with what the survey showed, that lifters are saying that this is what they're doing. Whereas um, I think that some of the other literature that's been done with powerlifters, I think that it's not published, but they tried to do like very long tapers, like with back squat, bench press, deadlift. And a lot of these have alluded to, these similar recovery times. I think that's the case again with maybe like weaker recreational local level folks. Yeah. But the national, international guys, I don't think that's the case. And I think that each one of those lifts should probably be programmed differently leading into those competitions. Um, so let's see. I think that's the overall thing. Like just the step taper group had a more desirable muscular environment, and then for the actual lifts, yeah, the squats and the bench was better for the step folks, whereas the deadlift was better for the exponential folks. So all of that work boils down to that for the most part. So
Well, I know you're shifting your efforts away from sports science a bit, but if you were to follow this up with, say, another study or more research examining, similar questions, how would you reorganize or restructure or create something that would answer the same question a little differently, or would you look at something else, or like, do you think this is kind of the lay of the land, and maybe getting more specifics would make sense, but you're not really going to find anything that we don't already know?
Yep. So, all right, folks, if you're listening, this is part two of the podcast. So, you just opened a whole other can of worms. So, yes, my whole entire last 5 years, all I've been doing is focusing on tapering, right? What is the most effective way to taper? What's the optimal way to taper? I'm going to say this right now. I do not think tapering is the most effective means of
Mm,
preparing for a competition. I really, really don't. And I say this because, well, hold on before I say this. If you're going to taper, I think that a shorter taper duration is probably the better route to go rather than a long taper. And you can get away with a shorter taper if all of your training is appropriate and you're managing fatigue and things like that leading up to that point. If you're having problems with all of that, maybe the longer taper would be better for you. But for the most part, out of all my experience and all the stuff I've done between weightlifters and powerlifters, these really short tapers seem to be most effective. We also did another study that just got published that was for training cessation. And so, or it just got accepted. It'll probably be out in the next 30 days, but training cessation is ultimately okay. Well, at the end of the taper, how many days should we take off leading into the competition? 1, 2, 3. If you recall, I was taking off 7 days before, like a dummy. And so the literature is quite like it's pretty clear that 7 days of cessation is not a good idea because you lose muscle. Like you lose muscle, strength decreases between 1 to like 5%. It's not good. So I think that future research and even folks that are just in the coaching world and the athlete world, because I think I almost called him Dr. Mike Teixeira. Coach Teixeira would probably, I think that they do this because Hayden and I have kind of discussed this. They tend to use more of just training cessation, preparing for meets for a lot of their folks, rather than these long, complicated drug out tapers. And so the other study that we did, we trained for like we again captured a training block and then took 24 hours off and then did 1 RMs. And
mm,
in that study, we had higher 1 RM improvements compared to the tapering peaking study. And so that really like questions, well, is a taper effect or the most effective means to prepare for competition? I say no. So I think the next step people should that are still going to do sports science maybe do a study where you do a taper versus no taper or just training cessation periods versus a shorter taper. I think that would probably be super super beneficial. If I were staying in sports science, that's probably something that I would try to get folks to do. But again, I think anecdotally we kind of know that um, just based off of what Tashira has done and some other folks as well. But yeah, because even with the weightlifting stuff that I did, I think that we have discussed this, you and I have discussed this before, but just doing training cessation after those overreaches, dude, their lifts were insane.
hmm.
Like compared to the competition lift would be like, actually on the platform, 10, 15 kilos less than what they did
Wow.
at quote unquote, they're 95% on the day post second week overreach. It's like, dude, there's something here. Like, there's something here. And it's probably just because with the taper, you're ultimately flirting with peaking or detraining. And the smallest manipulation of intensity or volume, like too high, too low, you're going to screw all that up. So why not train, 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 and then just take a day or two off, recover, because it doesn't take us very long to recover. Take a day or two off, recover, and then compete and crush everybody. I think that there's a lot of merit there, but that's just me. So
I think, yeah, again, you kind of mentioned this opening a can of worms, and I would agree with you, because what this does is it brings into question this concept of fatigue and fatigue accumulation, um, and how long that fatigue will stay with you kind of over time, right? And you're talking about taking a day off and being, fresh enough to hit personal records. And I brought this anecdote up on the podcast plenty of times, and I think a lot of people can probably listen and relate. I don't think I can count on the number of my, I don't think I can count on both hands the number of times I've had someone doing full blown training, right? Relatively high volumes of training, and they hit one RMs and one RM PRs in the squat, one RM PRs in the snatch, the clean and jerk, like a plethora of exercises, and that's like when they should, in theory, be the most fatigued. So it's either that in training it's not really accumulating or creating that much fatigue, or fatigue itself is a shorter term phenomena that kind of exists within the training plan. Maybe you can. I don't know if you have thoughts about fatigue and its role in creating like improvements in performance, or really anything about it. But based on what you said about the lack of a need to drastically taper, how does fatigue play into the all of this?
So yeah, so going back to like what you said with the fatigue accumulation prior to that, yeah, all that's definitely going to play a role. I think more than physiological fatigue, the psychological
Mm,
fatigue is probably going to either inhibit or allow you to express your performance. And I say this because I have literally like had someone jump, like do on a squat jump, counter movement jump, see their outcome, and I'm like, oh crap, they're fatigued. But I don't tell them that. I tell them something else. And then all of a sudden, like, then they start lifting and they just start crushing everything. It's like, well, like, okay, based off of this force output and this and this and this relative to baseline, you're supposed to be fatigued, but like, you are like, you're flying under the bar, like, you're turning the bar over, like, you're doing this, you're doing that.
mm,
And so, like, in the science world, I think that a lot of times we end up making athletes super scared of fatigue. Like, fatigue is so bad. Fatigue is so bad. Like, don't be fatigued. Like, you don't want to be fatigued. It's going to ruin you and crush your dreams. Like, at the end of the day, you need X amount of fatigue to actually adapt, right? And so I think that the idea behind fatigue, it's a lot more acute than what we actually think it
mm,
is. Just because, again, if you look at like this, the overreaching stuff versus or in conjunction with the training cessation, it's like, well, this doesn't make any sense compared to what we're typically told with the plethora of fatigue information that we have. So I just think that it's fatigue management is good. Don't get me wrong. You definitely need to play a significant role in your training program on fatigue management. But I think it's a lot easier to manage that than you think, particularly if you talk to your athletes and that communication line is there. And even if you do some sort of test and it tells you they're fatigued, well, let's start warming up and see what happens. And you can tell pretty quick, like, what's going on. And if you have a good enough relationship with your athletes, like, tell them that they're fatigued or trick them and make them think that they're not fatigued, and then see what happens and then make your judgment calls from there. Um, but yeah, I just think that a lot of times the fatigue stuff is just, it goes a little too far and gets a little overwhelming for folks, and then ultimately their performance suffers for a long time because of that. Like one of the athletes that we had discussed prior to starting the podcast, like that individual, he was always told like, well, you can't do this, this, and this because it's going to fatigue you. It's going to fatigue you. It's going to fatigue you. And then he leaves and goes elsewhere and gets appropriate training, meaning he gets enough volume to actually adapt. And now he is crushing everything. And it's like, well, what about all that fatigue stuff? What happened? Because now he's winning medals on international podiums. So that's my 2 cents, but I'm sure a lot of people will disagree.
No, well, I agree entirely, and I think you talk about fatigue management, and it's more so just creating sessions that facilitate the sessions that kind of drive you to where you want to go. So if you have a session with, say a top set or some sort of heavy single where you're working on the skill of the sport and you're creating some sort of like strength stimulus, if you want to call it that, and then you have a session later in the week that's a little maybe it's moderate to high volume, but it's like lower percentages, bar speed's a lot higher. Um, you're kind of managing fatigue that way, and then you can again track the response, track the amount of accumulated fatigue based on how the strength set is moving. So I think just in terms of being responsive in training, having some sort of metric built in is like really the way to go, because PRing your 3x5, like I don't know what that means for a 1
Yeah.
RM. It's really hard to say, and a 3 by 10 it's even more of a stretch. So I think, the closer you can get to the sport, do the sport, the more kind of dialed in you're going to be with knowing where you're at and what you're capable of. Now we covered a lot, and I think this was obviously a great podcast discussing tapering and peaking. Now you're moving outside of sports science into more just like muscle physiology stuff, I guess, just generally. Maybe you can talk about why you made that specific decision and what we could look forward to. Maybe the really, really, really nerdy people listening to the podcast, what they can look forward to with your future work.
Yeah, so I'm working out of Dr. Russell Heppel's lab at the University of Florida. And so what we do is just, we'll call it muscle science. I'm no longer doing human stuff just because you guys ruined it for me. I had to deal with you all every day of my life for 5 years. Over it. I need a break. So now it's more animal models, cell cultures, things like that. What's cool about that is that there's a lot of stuff you can do with mice and cells that you can't do with humans. So there's lots of implications for future things with athletes and whatnot. So one project that we just finished is so if you don't know what CRISPR is, we're doing some CRISPR studies, and ultimately we have these mice where we went in, edited genes. We took out what's called the BMAL1, and so we have these mice that are BMAL1 knockout mice, and so ultimately this is a gene that regulates muscle clocks. This is kind of cool because again, this could go back to training stuff, but there is a muscle respiration period between, like, I believe around 6 a.m., 6 a.m. is where it typically starts in humans, where it's at its highest, and then about 12 hours later it peaks again. Relative to training, you have a lot of people that like to train super early in the morning or super late in the evening. And so looking at this further, like with the muscle respiration, it's like, oh my God, because I like to train around like 4:35, 6 a.m. And then I have other people that like to train in the afternoons. But all this lines up with just this basic physiological muscle outcomes. So it's like, oh wow, that's kind of interesting. So we're doing stuff like that. Something else is like neuromuscular junction morphology.
Mm-hmm.
So looking at the changes of a neuromuscular junction during atrophy models. And so going into sport, I would actually, once I like really get this technique down and do everything, I would like to come back and potentially do this in sports science, because like fiber typing, yeah, it's cool and whatnot, but at the end of the day, it's a fiber type. It's probably not
Right.
doing more than what we think it really is, because going back to that sarcomere stuff I was talking about, the sarcomere branching, there's probably more merit there than just a fiber type contributing to an outcome. But we also always allude strength and power to the neuromuscular system. Well, what's happening at this neuromuscular junction? Are they
Mm-hmm.
increasing, decreasing, like during tapers or overreaches or normal training? So doing stuff like that would be super cool. I'm on like 9 or 10 projects right now, so there's a ton of stuff we're doing. But yeah, a lot of it deals again with like gene stuff, muscle mitochondria, the neuromuscular junction, and then we do cell culture things like growing myotubes and then getting them to actually turn into muscle fibers like over a series of weeks. And then do like all types of force transduction on them. And then like we make them atrophy and decrease. So, yeah.
Well, and someone who's read a lot about who's read about and listened to people talk about using CRISPR, is it a super complicated technique to use? Like, what's the process of putting that into practice? Just coming from my perspective, where I've heard people talk about other people doing it.
Yeah. So, to my understanding, so we do not actually like get to use the technology.
Hmm.
We order all the stuff, and then there's a specific group of people at the
Gotcha.
vivarium, and they're the ones that do it. I guess it like there's a lot of background training and things like that that goes into it, because ultimately what you're doing is you're taking the technology and then you're creating an organism or manipulating a said organism with that given technology, so that way when that organism grows, then you have this specific thing without this gene, or with
Right.
this gene overexpression, or this gene knocked out, right? So, to my understanding, some of the other countries, such as China and Russia, maybe, I don't know, I'm speculating here, but I believe that they have potentially used CRISPR with humans, with athletes, question mark, maybe, I don't know, but that would be the ultimate PED if so, which would be really cool. However, that's also how we end up with the Avengers. So maybe not a good, not a great idea, but a very cool idea nonetheless. So.
Yeah, that's all fantastic, and it sounds really, really interesting. So I'm looking forward to the work you continue pumping out. And I will say, I've been looking at ResearchGate. I follow you on there, and you like and share articles that are I can't even understand half of the stuff in there, and it makes me feel small, which I appreciate because it helps you realize you don't know that much. And that's just within this like small bubble that we both occupy. So I can only imagine the rest of the world. As far as if people are interested in possibly reaching out, I think you would be a good resource for people who are interested in getting into sports science. Sport physiology, stuff like that. If they have questions, they kind of want to bounce off of you. If they're thinking like, well, maybe considering what Kyle has said, maybe I might ask some questions and think about pursuing something else. Where can they reach out to either read your content, see the projects you're working on, or to bounce a few cues off of you if you have the available time?
Yeah, so ResearchGate is the best place to see all my stuff. Um, I guess email would probably be best if you want to reach out to me. I mean, I do have Instagram, so I mean, you could message me on there, and I can answer things there as well. Um, because I'm so busy, I keep all of my notifications turned off. So if
Mm,
I do see it, it's only like if I log on to whatever. So if you do send me something and I don't get to it like in a day, just give me a day or two. I'll reach back out. I promise. Um, yeah, I mean anything sports science related, sport physiology. I mean, that's cool with me. Like whatever you want to know, but I would note I'm pretty black and white, so I'm not gonna pretend like I know something that I don't. And if there's someone that I can like send you to that could address that question or concern, then I'll do my best to get you in touch with whomever that may be. But yeah, ResearchGate, and then Instagram. My Instagram handle is just Dr. Kyle Travis, all one word. Um, and then I guess if you link my ResearchGate in, they could
mhm.
access that as well. So yeah.
Yeah, I'll definitely do that. For people listening, go check out those resources. Incredibly valuable because if someone who in my opinion, if someone who is in the field doing research is sharing around other work, it's probably something you should pay attention to or think about or consider reading. As far as following me, you can catch me on Instagram at Josh_Phil WL. That's PHILWL. You can follow me on Twitter, on YouTube, kind of wherever. You can definitely catch me in the gym if you really need to talk to me. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed this episode of the podcast, and we will catch you all next time.